The topic of self is a tough topic to tackle. It's tough because there are so many different ways of conceiving of self. On this chart here, we have 12 or 13 different representations of self. And this should not be taken to be exhaustive. There are surely other ways of conceiving of the self. So the self doesn't seem to be this single unitary thing. It seems to be many different aspects of self, multiple representations. So that makes it challenging to study, but I submit the challenge is well worth the reward. The self is fundamental to who you are, to how you behave, and as difficult as it may be to understand, it's probably stands to have, the scientific understanding of the self will probably yield rewards and benefits and, make us more ourselves, be more self-actualized, you might say. We'll bring that up in a later slide. So let's think about some fundamentals of the self. First of all, self is a perceptual process. You don't automatically know who you are. You have to perceive yourself. Like all forms of perception, self-perception is a constructive process. Okay. We talked about vision and visual perception as being constructive. Perception of the self is another kind of perception, and since perception is constructive, then self-perception must be constructive. Self is your brain's best guess or construction about who you are. It uses the evidence of autobiographical memories to construct the self. That is, your brain uses the evidence of your past doings, the way you've behaved in the past. Perhaps you think somebody asks you, well, do you think you're a nice person? Well, if you think back in your autobiographical memories, it's like, well, I did help an old lady across the street last week. I think that makes me a nice person. Well, that'd be one way of constructing an idea of who you are. And of course, it would be a very different construction if you thought back in your memory and said, well, actually, I tripped an old lady walking across the street last week. Obviously, that's not a nice person. Okay? And being able to remember that you've done something like that is critical in understanding that you're not a nice person. So self is a perceptual construct, but it is a perceptual construct that may be completely constrained by society, by social interaction. To see this, go ahead and take about 30 seconds to think of and list 5 things about yourself. 5 things about yourself. I'll go ahead and pause for about 30 seconds. I submit to you that of all the things you wrote down, it's likely that all of them, or at least most of them, are socially defined. That they are true about you relative to the people around you. So for instance, you may have said stuff like you're smart, or you're pretty, or you're athletic, friendly, maybe you're grumpy. These are all socially defined. If you find yourself to be a rather smart person, well, you might be right, especially when sitting in a class at Northern Arizona University. However, if you were sitting in a class at Harvard, chances that you would feel as smart as you do during the NAU class is probably not that great, because there's going to be a higher concentration of really smart people in that Harvard class. And so you're smart relative to the people around you. You're pretty relative to you're athletic. Maybe you're more athletic than most of your friends, and that makes you feel like an athletic person. But walk into an NFL locker room, and suddenly you're not going to feel as athletic. Same thing with friendliness. You're friendly relative to who? There are people that are friendlier than you are, But if you're a friendly person, then there's probably a lot of people that aren't as friendly as you are. It's your friendliness is defined by where you fall in that continuum of friendliness or that continuum of grumpiness, what have you. So all the things we can say about the self seem to be socially defined. But even more fundamental than being socially defined, the self may not even come into existence without social interaction. So consider the statement here. The first person you became aware of was your primary caregiver. The first person you became aware of was your primary caregiver. Now, that doesn't necessarily sound controversial unless I point out to you what's implied here, which is that even before you were aware of yourself, you were aware of your primary caregiver. Even before you knew there was a you knew there was a mom, in most people's cases, of course. So the first person you became aware of was your mom, and only after your mom started to treat you like a self did you become aware that you are a self. So you don't become aware of yourself until you can recognize someone treating you like a self. Not only is there a mom, but mom keeps looking back at this thing that I'm going to call me. There's a me. So when we say the first person you became aware of was your primary caregiver, we mean even before you became aware of yourself. Now, one implication here might be that if you were the only person on the planet, you would have no sense of self. You know, imagine you were somehow born and were able to, sustain nourishment and to become an adult. And somehow you did this without any social interaction, no other people, no other kind of animals to have any social interaction with. Then this idea says, well, there would be no self there. Even by the time you're an adult, you would not have thoughts such as, I am smart, or I am athletic, or I am grumpy. Because all of these things are socially defined, and you are not embedded in a society. Therefore, you can't have a self-perception. Now let's talk about self as an emergent property. Now, the self is not like many other things in the universe. The self is not an object. It's a property. It's something that happens. To see what we mean here, let's consider the question, where is transportation in a car? You might want to say, well, the transportation is in the wheels. And I'll say, okay, well, let's take these wheels off this car and you can have the wheels. There, I've given you transportation. Well, no, of course that's not true. So, well, then maybe it's in the engine. All right, well, let's take the engine out of the car. I'll set it on blocks for you and you can have transportation that way. Well, no, that's not transportation. It's steering wheel. No, it's not in the steering wheel. It's not in any part of the car. It's not in the car at all. Transportation is something that happens when you get all the parts of a car in just the right working order, and then put a person in that car and have them drive down a street. When that person interacts with that car, which interacts with the road in just the right way, then transportation happens. It's not something we can hold in our hands. It's not an object. It's not a person, place, or thing. It's more like a verb. He is transporting. That's transportation in a car. Well, we can think of the self in a very similar sense. We could ask the question, where is the self in the brain? We'd say, well, if we're going to pick some large area of brain, then the first one we would go to would be the frontal lobes. The self is in the frontal lobes. All right, well, let's yank the frontal lobes out of some poor guy and put them on the table. Do we have a self? No, of course not. The frontal lobes have to be hooked up to the brain, the rest of the brain. And not only that, but the brain itself has to be hooked up to the body. And just a body floating around in space is probably not going to generate a self. It needs to be, well, it needs to be alive. It needs to be able to move and interact. It needs to be able to take in information from the environment around it and to output information, to manipulate the world around it. And it's only when all of those conditions are together that you get a self. Just like with transportation, you've got to have the person driving the car down a road. In order to get a self, you've got to have a brain feeling a body that is interacting with an environment. And then the self happens. So self, again, is more like a verb. He's selfing right now. Self is not something you can hold in your hands. It is something you can do, something that can emerge. So, to recap, neither is inside their respective objects, but rather they are properties that emerge from the interaction of the object with an environment. As I said, self is more like a verb than a noun. Rather than being a noun, a person, place, or thing, the self seems to be an action